If you're familiar with the current lingo in the personal development world, particularly when it comes to personal development and relationships, you've probably heard the terms secure, anxious, and avoidant attachment. Maybe you've got a pretty good idea of where you and your partner stand on the attachment spectrum, or maybe this is a newer concept for you. In any case, we have the pleasure of speaking with Bev Mitelman, an expert in integrative attachment theory, who will share her personal journey and expert insights on navigating different types of insecure attachment. Whether you're familiar with the concept or new to the topic, this episode is packed with valuable information that can help you understand and improve your relationships. This is Respected and Connected, the podcast that helps you create a more collaborative, intimate relationship. I'm Sharon Costanzo, and I'm your no-nonsense relationship coach. I've helped people just like you create stronger, more fulfilling relationships using the Better Marriage Blueprint. My mission is simple: to help you explore the complexity of intimate relationships, challenge your assumptions about what it takes to make it work, and learn to advocate for the kind of relationship you really want. You don't have to settle for a lonely, unsatisfying marriage, and I'm here to give you some tools and ideas about how to take the next step forward. To do that today, let's talk about attachment and how to understand why you and your loved ones seem to be operating with completely different rule books, and how to bridge the gap to feel more connected. So, Bev, the first question that I love to ask everyone is, how did you get into this work that you do, especially in regards to working with people and insecure attachment?
Yeah, such a great question. Thank you for asking that. I think you'll find a lot of people in our space come to it from a personal story and a personal journey. And this is, in fact, my story as well. I grew up in difficult circumstances. My house was not a stable, it's not a stable home. And so I developed as a child that had an insecure attachment. I went through most of my adult life not really understanding this at all. I knew that there were things, like I recognized some of my behaviors were maybe odd. I recognized that I didn't feel well in my body, like that I was on edge, I was irritable, I was hypervigilant, and I had sought the help of many different therapists, and I tried different modalities of therapy because, there's so many out there now. And, I tried like CBT and inner child, and that was helpful to a point. But
Mm-hmm.
what I realized is that I still couldn't get myself out of feeling the way that I was feeling. There was something missing. And so many years ago, I tripped over this work on attachment theory, and my mind just lit up. I was like, oh my gosh, this is what I'm living. I now understand my emotional patterns and why I think the way I do and why I act the way that I do, and how that's tied back to what I experienced in childhood. And so it brought together all of those missing pieces for me as a point of reflection and awareness. And then I was able to say, okay, now I can start working through some of these challenges, which is the beauty of the work. So to make a long story short, I discovered it because I needed help. And when it was so impactful for me, that's when I said, other people need to know about this. And so I had been working in the space of personal growth and professional development for years. This was my entire career. I was working an executive job, and I retired from that, and I went back to school and I got certified in attachment theory. And now this is how I spend my time because, again, I was grateful to find something that would help me understand my mind and ultimately feel better in my own skin, which, Sharon, and then like as soon as you feel better, you're able to connect with people authentically. Life has more of a purpose. like there's joy, like there's so many benefits. So, yeah, it's a big answer to your first
Oh,
question.
it is. And I think so many of us do, especially in like the personal development and the helping professions. Like it's very personal to us
Mhm.
how we've discovered whatever the modality or the approach or the lens it is that we use is usually very personally meaningful.
Very personally meaningful. I agree. And then like when something works and it really makes sense to us, like we're just so overwhelmed, like with the, oh my God, now I'm starting to feel better. Other people need to know about this. Like
Mhm.
it comes from a real place of
Yeah.
authenticity. I have to mention too that because I have tried so many other modalities. I did do EMDR, which was
Uh-huh.
eye movement desensitization therapy. This is to help release trauma in the body. I did that concurrently with the work that I was doing in my subconscious mind to reprogram some of
Mhm.
my core wounds. And the combination of the two was extremely helpful. So I always like to be
Mm.
upfront about that, keep an open mind about different modalities. And sometimes it's a
Yeah.
combination of things.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, and I guess that's a great question also because when I think of like attachment theory, I automatically go to EFT, to emotionally focused therapy and the work that Sue Johnson has done with that. But what you're saying is your attachment theory work was kind of working on some of those subconscious wounds.
So, there's a body of literature, obviously, that's theoretical, and then there's an
Uh-huh.
emerging body of literature that's more in the practical space in terms
Uh-huh.
of taking that awareness and now working through it. So, what I studied was integrative attachment theory. So,
Okay.
not only understanding just the baseline of what is attachment theory, but then actually looking at what are the core wounds,
Mhm.
the emotional patterns, the thought patterns, the communication style, the boundaries, the relationship that we have to boundaries, and then our behaviors associated to each one of these attachment styles. And it is fascinating work because it's incredibly predictive in
Mm.
terms of you can observe a person, let's say during a moment of conflict, and you could, with pretty good accuracy, identify their attachment style based on the way they interact or they communicate or the behaviors that they choose to use in a
Mhm.
moment of conflict or emotional distress, because it really is that prescriptive.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like it's so natural and instinctive, whatever it is that we do. And one of the things that I've observed is like we look at our partner and they react in a completely different way. And sometimes we're like, how in the heck did we see this situation so differently?
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, at some point, we do have this awareness of the fact that we all carry a lens, a
Mhm.
perspective, right? Like, and some people who haven't quite gotten to that thinking yet in their own minds, they really sort of stand on this, well, this is the truth. If you've
Yeah.
actually opened up, you realize that there's so many variations of the truth dependent on how you perceive the situation. So you and I could go walk into, for example, a party together,
Mhm.
right? And I could have, let's say, an incredible time and say that was the best night of my life. And you're at the same party and you can have, a completely different experience. And so the next day you and I are talking it and we're talking about our night before, and you and I are telling completely different stories, having been at the same events. And
Yeah.
it's obviously because of the way that we take in information, right?
Mhm.
It's so specific to the lens and the perception that we put onto things. And this extends also into, we often, for example, will study siblings or twins.
Mhm.
And I know this because I'm an identical twin. And so we're often like the subject of studies. And this is because researchers are always trying to discern the question of nature versus nurture, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we think that this is like a perfect microcosm to study two individuals, right? Two people exactly the same, came out of exactly the same home, they had exactly the same childhood, but that's a misnomer. There's no two people, even if they lived in the same home, that had the same childhood, because they're individuals, which meant that they had different interactions with their parents. They had different needs. They had different personalities. And so, I have this conversation often enough with people that there's no such thing as, that we lived the same childhood. You did not. And so you might find, I don't know if you have siblings.
Yeah, I
Um,
do. I have 3 brothers, so I
do
am
you?
unique in the fact that I was the only girl. But yeah, what you're saying is totally rings true. Like, we grew up in the same household and we had completely different experiences of our childhood.
Right. And it's so interesting, right? Because you might even talk about a specific event. You'll be like, don't you remember my 10th birthday party and this happened? And people will be like, I don't know what you're talking about. That didn't happen. Or people, so it has to do, of course, with our recall, but also
Mhm.
how we took in that information, our perception of what actually happened. And so that filter that we carry is so powerful.
Thanks so much for listening to the Respected and Connected podcast. It means the world to me that you're here and that you value strong, healthy relationships. If you like what you're hearing on the podcast and you know that it can help others, please take the time to rate, review, and share the podcast so that we can spread this message and reach more people like you who are looking for help to create more intimacy and collaboration in their most important relationships. Yeah. So tell me, like, the way this plays out often is we read a situation and then we react to it in a certain way. And usually that way that we react is counterproductive to creating the kind of relationships that we really want.
It can be. It can be. A lot of the times we misread things. So I always say humans, we're terrible at reading minds. So for some of us, let's say we're looking at our partner, we're having a conversation and we're trying to like read their mind, or we're trying to read between the lines, and what happens is our mind does this fabulous thing, and fabulous. It causes problems when we do this, is that when we only have some of the information, we tend to fill in the blanks. and, and we
Yeah.
tend to, so sometimes we create stories too, right?
Mhm.
So you must have done this because, right? And that could be true or not true, but already our emotional state is following this story that we made up that probably is not true. Most of the stories that we make up in our mind, like 90%, are not true, but we believe them to be true. We go back to the perception thing. So a person who is less self-aware will die on the hill that this is the truth. The best thing to do is to come from a place of curiosity instead of just running with what you think your interpretation is, because there's probably a misalignment there. If someone says something to you, like, you can say, I'm not sure I really understand why you're sharing this with me. What do you want me to take away from what you just said? Instead of, he's trying to tell me that I'm not a good partner, right? And this does play into attachment styles too, because our relationship to ourselves is very impactful. So those who generally have an insecure attachment, and do you want me to go into this a little
Yeah,
bit?
yeah, go into it for sure. Because I think our different attachment styles will definitely influence the stories that we tell ourselves.
your attachment style, I like to start off by saying that we don't diagnose people with an attachment style. In fact, everyone has an attachment style. It's not a mental illness, it's just a set of learned behavior. So when you are brand new to this world, you're highly 100% dependent on your caregiver. Whoever that is, you generally have, a primary caregiver. And the relationship that you establish with that individual sets a set of patterns in your mind for how to give and receive love. And these patterns follow you throughout your life. So you can see that that's when it would have the biggest imprinting.
Mm-hmm.
So someone who has a secure attachment, that means that they would have had an emotionally healthy relationship with their primary caregiver. So their physical needs and their emotional needs were met. So when the baby cried, the baby was attended to and the baby was coddled and the baby learned emotions through the expressions on the mother's face or the father's face. And the baby felt a sense of safety with the caregiver, right? As the child gets a little bit older, they learn about emotions, emotional regulations, their emotions are given space, and that respect and that safety is what's really important. A person that grows up with this type of environment, they learn that the world is all about connections, right? They've got a really healthy sense of self because they started to understand their own emotions and they respected their own emotions early on. They learned how to communicate them. They learned how to deal with difficult emotions. So you could imagine when that individual comes into the world, they do really well in adult relationships. These are the folks that are generally pretty even keeled. Like if they have something to say, they'll say it to you. Typically, this is not the group that we're finding high rates of like addiction in, for example, or other behaviors, that are self-destructive. Typically, we like to say, and the statistics vary depending on what study you look at, but it's estimated in North America that it's like 40 to 60%. So I like to say about 50% of the population has a secure attachment. But one of the things is that your attachment style is the number one predictor for the quality of the relationships you will have in your lifetime.
Mm.
So it really is that important. And so I studied under Thais Gibson. You probably know her.
Yeah,
I love
she
her
was on
work.
the podcast not too long ago, actually.
Oh,
So
really? Okay.
when
So
you said integrative attachment theory, I thought, oh, I wonder, I was going to ask you that question. So yeah.
yes, so you're spot on. One of the things that she talks about that I found so fascinating is she talks about how folks who, for example, might have two different attachment styles, and we will talk about the rest in a moment, that when they come together in a relationship, it's almost as if they have like the rule book or like the instructions of a different board game. So like someone shows up and they're playing Monopoly, and
Yeah.
the next person shows up and they're ready to play chess. Like you're playing completely different games. You have
Right.
a different set of rules. And it can be really
Yeah.
difficult to navigate. And what this work does, of course, is it sort of opens this up, right? People are starting to become aware of their own attachment styles,
Mhm.
and where those, pain points can be. So we'll leave the discussion about whether it's actually 50% on the table.
Right. Yeah. Who knows? But I love
Who
what
knows?
you said, though, that like the more securely attached you can be, the higher quality of relationships you will have.
100%.
And I'm just
100%.
wondering, like, as you're thinking about that, because I see this often, I'm sure you do too, that it's our tendency when we're in struggling and we're stuck in relationship dynamics that aren't working. It's just like you said, we're playing from different rule books, so to speak. So it's really easy for us to look at and say, well, obviously my partner is the problem. And if they would just change, then things would be better for both of us.
We know that, entering into a relationship with someone for their potential, trying to change them, or staying in a relationship with the hope that someone will change is futile. Like, we know that. So when a human wants to change anything about themselves, they have to have their own intrinsic motivation. They have to have that commitment and dedication, whether they're trying to change anything psychologically or anything emotionally, anything physically, right? If you want to get in shape, partner can't do that for you. You got to go to the gym. You got to, make the changes to your diet. And it's the same thing with your attachment style. If there are things that you have certain behaviors and communication patterns that are coming, into the relationship and causing problems, it's important for you to recognize that for yourself, right? So it's like very easy to point the finger at someone else, right? So like let's use a real example here. So let's say that um, you really, really wish that your partner was more affectionate with you. So let's talk about why your partner may not be as affectionate with you. What does affection look like? Is it holding hands? Is it cuddling on the couch? Is it kissing in public? Why does your partner not feel comfortable? Instead of just wishing that they would, what in their pattern says that maybe this is wrong or this is only to be done, for example, behind closed doors, or maybe they're not feeling romantic towards you? There's so many different reasons. And then lastly, why is it important to you that your partner be more, attentive or romantic towards you or show you more affection? Because we're talking about physical affection. Well, a lot of the times, physical affection is a human need that we have. It's one of the love and connection is one of the six human needs, but we prioritize them differently. So have you explained to your partner why it's so important to you, right? Have you said, when you hold my hand, it just really gives me a safe, calming feeling that I love, and only you can do that for me.
It's way better to do it that way than to complain. Or I think like the sister to complaint is why. Why don't you do this? The worst one
The
is.
worst one is you're only affectionate with me when you want sex, which is such a disconnecting thing to say because a lot of people, I'm not going to say just men, because this isn't specific to genders, it's more specific to attachment stuff. A lot of people will show physical affection through sexual contact,
Yeah.
through sex. And so that's how they know to show affection. Right.
Mhm.
So again, set of learned behaviors. There's a lot of negotiation and communication that has to happen in these relationships so that both of you get your needs met. I honestly believe that most people don't actually know or haven't taken the time, and this is work to really figure out, what do you need?
Most of my clients, when they start out, it's exactly right. Like, it's really easy to access that I'm not happy, I'm not comfortable, something's wrong. It's a lot harder to think about, okay, what do I need from a like a more mature place, not the insecure part of us that's, if we're an anxiously attached person
Mm,
looking for reassurance outside of ourselves, or the more avoidant person just wanting peace and wanting to be left alone. I think it's so
yeah.
important to think about what we need and then also to be aware of what is our attachment style. Because if we are kind of far away from what I call the circle of health, what we're trying to get our partner to do for us to make us feel better probably isn't what we really need in the relationship.
Yeah, a lot of times there's a disconnect between what we actually need and what we want. If we're unclear about what we need or what the real issue is, we tend to get to a point of frustration. We can feel that our needs aren't being met, but we can't articulate what that is. So we have different ways that we communicate, different ways that we love each other, right? We show and give and receive love and the love languages, and there's so
Mm.
much literature around this. But often what you're dealing with is people who have just different patterns. we established that, folks who have a secure attachment, we're like 40 to 50%. Let's say. So the other segment of the population has what we would call insecure attachment.
Mhm.
Now, you know that within the spectrum of insecure attachment, there's a couple different styles. On one end of the spectrum, there's the anxious preoccupied. On the other end of the spectrum, there's the dismissive avoidant, and somewhere in the middle is the fearful avoidant. Now, what these all have in common is that they all came out of homes where they did not get consistent emotional attunement from their caregiver.
Mm.
So they all came out of homes where they didn't feel that sense of safety. They
Mhm.
generally didn't learn to recognize their emotions. Their emotions weren't given space. They weren't taught how to emotionally regulate themselves. So they come into the world and they have a different viewpoints, right? They tend to see the world more about survival than connections.
Mm.
And so it's a very different landscape. And when we talk about core wounds, I think we mentioned that earlier. The wounding that we receive in childhood, even someone who's secure will have some core wounds, but they won't be as deep. There won't be as many. So with the folks who have insecure attachment, they tend to have more core wounds. They're bigger. And the one that they share between the three of them, the one core wound that they all share is I am unsafe. So this is what we would call generally people who are more emotionally volatile. So when something triggers them, and they do get triggered more often, and they go right to their survival patterns,
Mhm.
right? Which is their coping mechanisms. So the anxious preoccupied is generally someone who experienced some form of abandonment or perceived abandonment, or, they were the child who was constantly trying to get the attention of an emotionally unavailable parent, or maybe someone who was mentally ill, someone who had addiction. So it's this constant yearning. They didn't get that safe environment. And so they grow up with a distinct emotional pattern where they feel lonely a lot of the time. They feel sadness. I am disliked. I'm unlovable. I am not good enough. These are some of those big core wounds that we find. And so when we see these folks come into adulthood and they come into romantic relationships, these are the folks that generally need a high degree of reassurance, validation. You already talked about this. You know your stuff. I can tell. So you already talked about this. These are the folks that will, when they're in a romantic relationship, will call their partner multiple times a day. Are we okay? You sure? Because you sound weird. Everything all right? They're afraid. They're afraid you're going to leave them. Whether they admit to this or not, it's at the subconscious level. They might not have awareness of this. But when we're clinging towards something and it becomes almost like, please don't leave me, I need you in my life, the same way, the same pattern that you would have experienced clinging to and desperately seeking the attention of a caregiver when you were younger.
Mhm.
So relationships that we have with our friends, with our colleagues, with our family, for sure. But they're most pronounced in romantic relationships. And
Mhm.
that's because the person that we choose to be our romantic partner is generally the person that we're affording the most amount of trust. It mirrors, as close as you can get, the relationship of the caregiver. So your partner is going to be able to trigger you in a way that no friend will.
I think that's such a great thing to point out because sometimes I
Mhm.
think we look at our partner and we think, I don't have any problems with anyone but you. It must be you that is the problem. But I
Right.
think no, it's the nature of the relationship
Yes, it
that
is.
brings up stuff that no other relationship brings up.
that,
Mm-hmm.
even though we're both adults and we're equals and we can take care of ourselves, we do in a romantic relationship want to depend on our partner in a way that we don't depend on anyone else.
100%. That's part of the beauty of a romantic relationship, right? It's like you're in the inner circle,
Yeah.
right? So, and if you're truly getting to a place of vulnerability, I'm going to share everything, and we're going to rely on each other. That's, I think that's what we all strive for. We tend to gravitate towards what's familiar because our subconscious mind, it knows how to handle that situation. It's like, this is
Right.
familiar. I know what to do. Okay, I got
Yeah.
this.
It's
Right.
predictable, even though it's not very pleasant. So, what can someone do if they see some of these patterns? What can they do to move towards a more secure attachment?
There's a period by which I think awareness is really important. When I start speaking to people about attachment styles, usually they do a little bit of reading on their own. I tell them to start taking note of, like, mental note or even writing it down when you're in conflict with someone. If you're talking again about your romantic partner, you tend to have the same conversation over and over, like two
Yeah.
weeks apart. You're still talking about the dishes from 2 years ago because it's like unresolved, right? Take note of that and sit on it for a moment, because that's giving you beautiful information about where your wounding is and
Mm.
what you still need to heal. So, take some time to build awareness. I also have a little quiz on my website at securelylove.com
Mhm.
that will help you identify what your attachment style is. So, all of this is about raising awareness for your own pattern. If a client comes to me and they want to fix their partner, that's not what this is about.
Right.
This is understanding you. I'm gonna circle back because I do want to kind of finish and I didn't do a great job. I
No,
went
you're
off on
good.
a tangent,
No, we're
but
good.
we didn't talk about the dismissive avoidant or the fearful
Oh,
avoidant.
yeah.
So these are the other two categories. There's three subcategories within insecure attachment. So the dismissive avoidant generally experienced a degree of neglect, or they were parentified, or they had to do a lot on their own. This is the individual that grows up and they are overly self-reliant. They are hyper independent. They kind of have this mindset that, I will meet my needs and my partner is responsible for meeting their own needs. And that's because in childhood, they didn't have that support. So they grew up going, I got to learn to survive on my own.
So, why do dismissive avoidants get in long-term relationships?
At the core, we're all humans, right? We all have a core need for love and connection at various degrees. So there is an element of, I want companionship, but I also want my space.
Mm.
They have a core wound that's very specific to them, which is, I am defective. So it's almost like they keep people out, because if you come too close to me, you will realize that I'm defective and you'll leave me anyways. And so these folks really, they do life mostly in an independent way, but that doesn't mean that they also don't crave love, connection, intimacy, but in a different way,
Mhm.
right? So intimacy looks really different for them. When you meet someone who's anxious, preoccupied, they're generally very warm. They're very welcoming. They're very like, come on in. And if you have a conversation with someone within an hour, you know their entire life story. They tend to over explain. They're really open. And that's how they connect. But on the other side here, they're completely opposite. Like, they like to stay in their own space. They can be social, but like for periods of time, they don't want to be necessarily burdened with someone else's emotions because they're pretty detached from their own. Their survival strategy was to detach from their emotions.
Mm.
So that's what they learned.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard someone say, why would I bother to ask anyone for help? I can do it better on my own. So the dismissive avoidance, they do they crave, I would say that connection, but it is often very difficult for them to be in a relationship, especially a relationship that requires a level of vulnerability and emotional expression that they don't really know how to do, that makes them like
Mm.
really uncomfortable. So you see a lot of pull away. Their strategy when they're feeling unsafe is they pull away. You'll see stonewalling, you'll see that they ignore, they'll let 3 days go by before they respond to a text. And it's often interpreted as really rude, arrogant behavior. The truth is, and I'm not saying that anyone should ever accept behavior that they deem to be disrespectful, because you have to do what feels right to you. But what I know is that these folks, they're taking time away to regulate, to
Yeah.
calm down.
And it
So
sounds
they're
like it
escaping.
takes a while.
It can.
Yeah.
It can, depending on, the level of wounding, depending on the
Right.
context, depending on how serious things are. Um, and so it's not easy for someone who has a secure attachment or an anxious preoccupied attachment to understand the mind of a dismissive avoidance, because someone who has a secure attachment, because they've learned emotional regulation, that other people's behavior is theirs to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, when someone has an insecure attachment style, they tend to make it about themselves, especially the anxious preoccupied. Now, as luck would have it, the anxious preoccupied and the dismissive avoidant tend to find each other in relationship. But when the dismissive avoidant pulls away, that really, really triggers the abandonment wound of the anxious preoccupied. And then from their lens, they're like, I must have done something wrong. Maybe I said something wrong. Maybe I wore the wrong outfit, or maybe I sent him,
Yeah.
a
Maybe there's
text,
something I can do to fix this.
and they try to fix it, and so they go into fight mode. They will do anything and everything, like, please don't leave me, or they go into people pleasing mode, which is another trauma response, right? Fawning. And the dismissive avoidant is just trying to take some space. Most interestingly enough, out of that whole spectrum of insecure attachment, there's a fourth category that's called the fearful avoidant, and I'm kind of in the middle because they do fall in the middle, where they exhibit traits of both the anxious preoccupied and the dismissive avoidance. It used to be called disorganized attachment, and that's not a bad word for it, actually. It just means that the child grew up in a high degree of chaos, oftentimes abuse, and they emotionally bonded to their caregiver in a disorganized way. And what that means is, and I've lived this because I lived my life predominantly as a fearful avoidant, uh, is that they will seek out the comfort and safety and security of their caregiver. But oftentimes the caregiver is the same individual who is emotionally, physically, or sexually, or all of the above, harming them. And so the child becomes really conflicted in their psyche. All I want is the love and attention and acceptance of this person, but this person's also hurting me. And so you can tell how they want to move towards connection, but they really fear getting too close. And so this person, the fearful avoidant, is often referred to as the hot and the cold partner. One
Mm.
minute, they're really present and the connection is forming. The next minute, they pull away, because if they feel like the vulnerability or the connection is getting too strong, their fears come online. So they pull away to dampen their fears, and then, a couple of days pass and the fear goes away, and then that desire to reconnect again. So they reconnect again. Again, they're anxious and they're avoidant. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a good combination of traits. And
Yeah.
it's not fun to be on the receiving end of that, or to be the fearful avoidant. It's really, really confusing in the mind of a fearful avoidance. And I could speak personally on this because I too, have a desire for love and connection. But there were many times in my life before I did this work, where it just really scared me. Like
Mhm.
even when we had a deep conversation, I felt overwhelmed. My anxiety would spike, and I would have to leave the room, or I'd have to take some space or do something because it was really frightening to me. And this is one of the most impactful things that I learned about my own behavior and how it related back to my childhood. And there were things that I did as a child to find safety. So, for example, when I would hear let's say my father come home, and I would listen for the tone of voice and I would assess the threat. Like, is he in a bad mood? Is something going on? Is there conflict? And if I heard anything, I would immediately run into, there was a bathroom next to my bedroom. And the bathroom was the only room in my home that had a lock. So I'd lock myself in the bathroom for hours and hours and hours because I was trying to find safety. And I had forgotten about that until a friend reminded me. Because as an adult, I was still doing the same thing.
Mm.
And we laugh about this because until you sit down and analyze your own behavior and create that sense of self-awareness, you don't
Yeah.
really think, why am I doing this? And so when I was married for a long time, 23 years, and I remember if I felt emotionally stressed, I would say to him, okay, Hannah, I just have to go to the washroom. But that was my way to escape. And I would go to the washroom and I'd spend 2 hours in there,
Mhm.
not doing anything other than just escaping. And he was
Yeah.
like, this is crazy behavior. Why are you locked in the bathroom? And I was like, um, and I realized I'm locked in the bathroom because I'm trying to protect myself from my father, who
Mm.
I no longer live with.
Right.
Right? I'm not
Right.
afraid of my husband. He's a wonderful man. But we still bring these patterns and these coping behaviors
Mhm.
into, right? And so it's all of these things that we do to try and regulate our nervous system, right? So those who are fearful avoidance, they have a fair burden in that they've got more triggers than most. Their behavior can, oscillate again between anxious and avoidant. It's difficult. I want to really be specific. Like, these are good people. They're kind-hearted people. They didn't learn the proper skills in
Mhm.
how to connect and emotionally bond with people. And I like to say that, some households you learn like how to cook. And some people come out of homes and they don't know how to cook, and they certainly don't know how to regulate their emotions.
Yeah.
And that's where we're at, right? And so that's part of the work that I do is we talk about awareness. We
Mhm.
understand your attachment style, where are your core wounds, how is this playing out in your relationships, where are the points of friction, how is this playing out in your relationship to boundaries, your coping mechanisms. Again, in this echelon, people in the insecure attachment group, we see very distinct patterns of how they relate to boundaries. So, someone who's anxious, preoccupied, generally has no boundaries. They're almost offended at the idea of boundaries. It's like they just show up at your house and they're like, hey, I showed up for coffee. So, they don't really understand boundaries. And when you try to impose boundaries onto them, they take offense. Whereas a dismissive avoidant is very good at keeping their boundaries.
Yeah.
So the last boyfriend that I dated, he was dismissive avoidant, and don't show up unannounced. Got it. I'll give you the code to my house, but never use it unless it's an emergency. Okay, got it. Um, you know, always let me know if you're going to be late. Okay, got it. Like, really? And I was like, okay, this is how I respect you. But he was clear.
Yeah, he knew kind of what his comfort level was, and he was able to
Yeah, he
communicate
knew.
it. And I love
Yeah,
how you talked through, kind of all of those different attachment styles, and how what I'm taking away from it is first being aware
yeah,
of your attachment style and how it's impacting your relationships. And then when you're in a relationship, being very clear, communicating and negotiating rather than just assuming. Like, I think negotiating and agreements is like gold for couples, because then you have a new rule book that works
yeah,
for both of you. I think we have this fantasy, and it's kind of going around online right now, this whole just notice and do, this fantasy that, oh, my partner should just notice what needs to be done and do it, whether it's housework or something else. And it's like, you know what? We come with different operating instructions. Noticing and doing is a fantasy, but talking through
yeah,
things and saying, hey, it's really important to me that if you're going to be late, you let me know. Hey,
yeah,
I'm feeling a little bit triggered right now. I need some time to myself. It's not a rejection of you at all. I just need some time. Talking through some of those things can really help us to create more
yeah.
secure, loving relationships.
I love how you mentioned you have your own rule book, and that really it is what it is. You need to develop that rule book. You need to, you know, understand each other, and it could be really, really small things. Like,
Mhm.
I was dating a man once after my separation, and when we were texting, I tend to use a lot of thumbs up because I'm just a minimal texter. Like, see you
Yeah.
at 7. Like, and he actually said to me, listen, can you not use the thumbs up? And I was like, why? And he's like, it really makes me feel disrespected. And I was like, I will never use it again. I had no idea. So,
Yeah.
as humans, we are horrible at reading each other's minds. I would have never known
Yeah,
that
because
this
of
he
course your
saw.
intention wasn't to be disrespectful.
No, but it's and I bring that up as such a minute example. But just being able to communicate. So, if you're the dismissive avoidant and you really need time, right? A dismissive avoidant really hates conflict. They want harmony in their relationship. And so, if they need time to decompress and really collect their thoughts before they're ready to respond in a rational way, come up with an agreement. Like, it's not okay for the dismissive avoidance to just disappear, but maybe it's like, all right, I understand you need a couple of hours. How about we meet back here after dinner, 8 or 9 o'clock, and we can have a conversation. Like, instead of forcing it in the moment,
Yeah.
uh, and oftentimes that works.
Mhm.
So we see a lot of memes on the internet where, dismissive avoidants are men and
Yeah.
anxious preoccupieds are women. Well, that's true, but the reverse is also true.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
for
not
sure.
gender. There are plenty of women who have dismissive avoidant tendencies. And the other thing is that they're not like set boxes. Nobody sits in a box like so completely. It really is a continuum. So
Mhm.
you can be mostly secure but lean anxious.
Mhm.
Or, you can be, fearful avoidant and lean dismissive or lean anxious. When you become aware of your own patterns and why you're executing on certain patterns. And again, you have to bring the patterns to your awareness because they sit at the subconscious level, right? So
Mhm.
unless we do the work to actually bring them to awareness, to call them out, to understand the core wounds, and then we talk about reprogramming core wounds.
Mhm.
There's a
Yeah.
way that we can work with the subconscious mind to actually build new narratives, build new stories, right?
Mhm.
Because these core wounds, they really do affect our behavior. Like, you could imagine someone, for example, who has the I'm not good enough core wounds. Well, that person, they may never apply for the promotion at work. They may never try that dance class that they wanted to try. That person may never talk to their secret crush. They may, like, all of these things, because they've got this little story in their head, I'm not good enough. So recognizing that these stories are holding us back and those core wounds, it's not easy work to bring this forward, but it's very rewarding.
Yeah.
Because when you can figure all this out and then work through it and start developing new narratives, your emotional patterns do change. Certainly your thought patterns, your behaviors change. And the best part of it for me, and I speak from personal experience, is that my level of anxiety significantly decreased. I kind of wish people just knew how good it feels when you get to the other side. And so emotional regulation of yourself is a byproduct of becoming securely attached. And becoming securely attached means that you're redefining the relationship that you have to yourself. You're learning to trust yourself and to connect in a more authentic and trusting way with others.
Yeah. Well, that's so beautiful and such a good. I know we could just keep talking forever and ever, but we've gone way over our time, and that's totally
I'm so
fine.
sorry. I didn't even realize.
You're good. You're good. I love how the thing that I just got out of that though was how I think, emotional regulation is such a buzzword in the personal development sphere. And I think so many of us are trying to kind of like power through emotional regulation. Whereas what you're saying is if you can do it in a more holistic way to kind of look at the attachment and as you become aware and kind of reprogram some of these things and have some different stories, the emotional regulation kind of naturally comes out of that whole endeavor.
Yeah, it does. It's really important work.
It is important work.
Yeah, it is.
Well,
I'm sorry we've gone over time.
You're totally fine. You're totally fine. Thank you so much for being on. There's so many interesting insights that you've shared with us today, and I'm really excited to share this with our audience. So tell us really quick one more time, what is your website if people want to find you?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm the founder of Securely Loved. So securelyloved.com. We are a collective of relationship and attachment trauma practitioners. So this is specifically the area that we work in. If you go to securelyloved.com, there is a little button there that says take an attachment quiz. You can do that as a starting point. It's totally free, just to get a sense of, your own patterns. And you can book a free 20-minute consult with myself or any of the practitioners working with Securely Loved. And we'll go from there. I'm so grateful just to be doing this work and sharing this with folks.
Yeah. Well, cool. Well, thanks again. I'll post the link to that website in the show notes for those who are listening. Thanks so much for listening to the Respected and Connected podcast. It really means the world to me that you're here and that you share my vision for meaningful, satisfying relationships. If you found value in what you heard today and you're ready for something more, click the link in the show notes to access more programs and resources to help you on your journey of creating meaningful, satisfying relationships.